My name is Emily Ruska. I'm with the Education Systems Center at Northern Illinois University. I'm one of the staff members for the College and Career Readiness Committee of the Illinois P20 Council. On behalf of the CCR committee, I just want to welcome you all today and just say thank you for joining us. I'm going to give a general overview, and I want to hand it over as quickly as possible to our colleagues at the EdTrust to dive in. But we'll start with a brief background on the Equity Targets work group, of which most of you are members, and if you are not, we will provide opportunities and information on how to join. We'll do some inclusion with small group discussions about the issues that we're going to tackle today. Our colleagues from the EdTrust are going to do a presentation on their Hard Truths report, which is all about race-conscious policy in education, in higher education. We'll have a small group discussion of the policy implications outlined. We'll do some reporting out in closing. We are recording this, so please keep yourselves muted so long as you are not speaking. We, again, will have plenty of time to discuss in small groups and some with the larger group. Again, please link your phone audio and video. The purposes for today is really building a shared understanding, reconvening, building a shared understanding of the what and why of race-conscious policy, and identifying any opportunities we might see to apply in our Illinois context. We will rely heavily on the chat box as well, so please just keep on using that. Appreciate all of you who have introduced yourselves thus far. And then, again, looking forward to this great discussion. So, again, briefly, just to provide some background on the Equity Targets work group of the College and Career Readiness Committee, the core goal of this work group is to provide recommendations to the full P20 Council around updating our state's post-secondary attainment goal, which is currently a general goal of 60% of Illinois adults having a high-quality post-secondary degree or credential by 2025. Our state legislature passed Senate Resolution 1647 and House Resolution 1017, which acknowledge that there are significant gaps across racial and socioeconomic subgroups in terms of post-secondary access, completion, and attainment, and directed the P20 Council to update our goal to make recommendations around how to close those gaps. So the work group is both having conversations about what the data looks like and the status quo, and we have some colleagues from the Midwestern Higher Education Compact who are doing our projection study, so we understand what things would look like in a disaggregated way if status quo holds over the next 5-10 years. And we're also having discussions around policy, which is why we're here today. We've got a diverse range of folks on the line here today, just like we do in the work group. If you are on the line because you got forwarded this invite, or you came to us through the IHEN group and you want to join the work group, please feel free to email Latanya Hicks at the email address below, and we'll repeat that later as well. But I just wanted to offer this background and then turn it over to our colleagues at the EdTrust who are going to guide us in their presentation today. So take it away, EdTrust friends, and I'm happy to click through to advance as we need.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation, Emily. We really appreciate it, and thank you to everyone for taking the time out for this conversation today. My name is Tiffany Jones. I direct the higher education policy work at the Education Trust, and I will be joined in this presentation by my colleague, Dr. Marshall Anthony, who will be presenting as well today, who's on our research team. But what we're going to focus on in our conversation is talking about a lot of what we'll talk about today is in a report called Hard Truths, Why Only Race-Conscious Policy Can Fix Racism in Higher Education. It's a report, we released it back in January. And of course, with everything going on in terms of an elevated conversation around how to address systemic racism in the broader society, and especially in higher education, we're looking forward to a rich discussion today and learning and hearing from you all as well. And hopefully what we share with you will provide some tools and information to help you move forward in the work that you all are doing. So what we'd like to do first is start off with a small group conversation. I think we can advance to the next slide. Perfect. And so what you all are going to do is be split into small groups of around 10, and you're going to discuss the following 2 questions. There'll be someone there who will be somewhat of a facilitator, but it's really an informal conversation. And of course, you will discuss why it's so hard to talk about race. And often, what responses do you hear when you try to raise these conversations around the intersections of race and education policy? And of course, how folks in your broader community react to these conversations. And then when we come back together, we'll share out a bit around what you discussed in your small groups and move forward with the presentation. So at this point, we can go ahead and transition Emily into those small groups. Okay, are you all able to hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Thanks, Tiffany.
Okay, perfect. And I apologize. I know someone got cut off in my room. If other folks got cut off mid-sentence in the other rooms, apologize in advance. And just also excited that represents it. Hopefully everybody was having rich conversations as well. We do have just a few minutes where there's an opportunity, perhaps if folks want to say a little bit about some of the themes that came up in the conversations they heard. I'll folks mention things like, color. We're taught that it's impolite to talk about race, and raised to be colorblind can make it challenging to have these conversations. And also folks kind of feel sometimes ill-prepared. They don't know the right language to use to even begin the conversation. And as a result, feel more comfortable talking about other things like income and other disparities. So I'll pause there to see if anyone else would like to highlight a couple of themes from the conversations they heard.
Hi, this is Aspen Clemens with Chicago State. And I think one of the things that we have to be very careful not to forget when having this conversation is that there is privilege in the ability to decide not to talk about race. That for many, that privilege is not afforded. And that's out of necessity and safety. Many parents of children of color in this country have had to have conversations with their children about race that may be age inappropriate at a very early age in order to keep them safe. So I think it's very important for us in this format to acknowledge that there's a privilege to make the decision to say, I find it hard to talk about race, so I'm not going to do it. And I think we should make that acknowledgement.
We definitely appreciate that reflection as well. Yes. Anyone else? I think we have time for at least one more reflection.
Yes. This is Sean Williams-White with the Midwestern Higher Education Compact. And some of the things that came up in our group was that the reason why it's hard to talk about race is because they feel that they're being attacked personally, or if they don't share the predominant view, they're afraid of being called racist. Also, people often cast the conversation in terms of the guilty versus the innocent. And also that it's just messy and complicated. And finally, it's hard to face that you benefited from racist systems when you yourself is not a racist.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I think for the sake of time, we're going to move forward. I do want to flag that you will have an opportunity to talk with that small group again later in the presentation as well. And please continue to engage, use the chat function to, say amen, say I totally disagree, or whatever you would like to write any reflections there. Please feel free to continue and just say thank you to those who just spoke up and offered up those themes. And you're absolutely on point. And we often found ourselves as the Education Trust, we're an organization that focuses on low-income students and students of color, and found over time when we're talking with policymakers and other advocates, is a lot easier to have those conversations around income or first generation students, and a lot more resistance when we're talking specifically about race and racism in higher education. There's other advocates who like to push those conversations, but found it was difficult as well. And what they did is ask us, you know, hey, could you put together some arguments, some data points all in one place that we could use when we're trying to advance or push those conversations when it's really hard. And so that was kind of the motivation behind why we even put that report together the way that we did. And was also important for us, again, to arm these advocates so that they could push back on some of those narratives around being colorblind and moving forward. And so one thing in terms of the framing that's in the report, and again, that coincides with our purpose, a lot of folks would say, again, we should be colorblind. That's the right thing to do. That's the moral thing to do. That's what Dr. King would want us to do. And so it's really important for us in this report and in the conversations we have with policymakers and advocates to emphasize that though Dr. King fought for the rights of all poor people, for example, in the Poor People's Campaign as one example, he also talked quite a bit about righting the wrongs of racism specifically, talks about what it would mean to repay the debt that's owed for free labor, and how race-conscious policies in particular are necessary to, again, address actual racism. And so, again, folks often like to quote Dr. King as representing a different perspective, is endorsing being colorblind. And it was important for us to, again, encourage people to look at his full body of work, look at the things that he necessarily promoted in a more comprehensive way, to understand that the only way for us to move forward is to acknowledge the past and address it. So if we could go to the next slide. In the report, we do make 3 core arguments. So I'm going to talk really quickly through what those arguments are, and I'm going to turn it over then to my colleague, Dr. Marshall Anthony, to talk about some of the data that's included there that help make the case for why this is necessary. Then I'll jump back in and talk a little bit about what does race-conscious policy even look like, both at the institution, state, and federal level, and then we'll conclude with some small group discussion around what it means to kind of advance race-conscious policies in your state, and then we'll also, of course, have time for questions and answers and a broader discussion. So really quickly, the 3 main arguments that we make in the report. The first, higher education has used racist policies to exclude students. Therefore, race-conscious policies are necessary to achieve racial justice. This may feel very obvious, like common sense. However, even in this moment, as higher education leaders put out statements about systemic racism they see in, let's say, policing or in criminal justice more broadly, still too few are willing to self-reflect on higher ed as a system, on their own institution, on the ways in which state or federal policy as it relates to higher ed has used explicitly racist policies in the past that set up and create the situation where we have the inequities that we're hopefully all trying to address today. So what we do in the report, again, is try to walk through some examples of that. I'll give you one really quickly now and say, so for example, the Supreme Court case, the Adams case in the 70s, that was an example where 19 states were found guilty by the Supreme Court of operating separate and unequal systems of higher education. What was asked is that those 19 states would submit plans for addressing this. And that basically meant that the places that were admitting Black students received fewer dollars in the white institutions that excluded Black students. And again, most of the states did not even bother to submit a plan for how they were going to rectify this. A few did and never followed through on the things that they said that they would do in those plans. And this is why some of these lawsuits between historically Black colleges in their state systems continue to this day. The state of Maryland is a great example. It was one of those 19 states. They are continuing litigation as we speak. Most recently, the governor, vetoed a bill that would have tried to make right some of these funding inequities and provide the historically Black colleges with the resources that they had been providing to their white institutions in the state. In many cases, in states where it's been settled, like Mississippi, the states got fewer, the HBCUs or historically Black colleges got far fewer dollars than what was asked for or deemed by the court, often because states would put in all sorts of prerequisites to keep them from getting the funding, like demanding they enroll a certain percentage of white students before they could access the dollars. And so again, understanding how some of these policies have played out in higher ed is really important in understanding today's context, and also make the case for why it's important that really active, intentional policy to rectify them is necessary. The other argument we try to make is that, you know, racial inequalities remain, and in some cases have gotten worse because race-conscious policies that did exist were only existed for a short time, and it often limited their ability to be effective. This really matters because the general consensus, or most folks might believe that progress is being made, perhaps it's being made far too slow, but we're probably inching towards where we need to be. And that's just not true in some cases. And so just for example, we talk about in the report related to degree attainment, it's a younger generation of Black adults that have a lower degree attainment than the older generations, which the opposite is true for their white peers, for example, and other racial and ethnic groups where the younger generations are becoming more and more educated. And some of that has to do with, there were some race-conscious policies that resulted from the fruits of the labor of the civil rights movement. But it was just about a decade later that they were being challenged in the Supreme Court and rolled back as if that was enough time for any progress to be made, and continue to be rolled back. Affirmative action is an example of that. And to this day, there's still at least about 8 states that have statewide bans on affirmative action. But again, affirmative action was only around for about a decade before its first Supreme Court challenge, and again began rolling those things back. And so again, that some of that rolling back too soon is part of why we're where we are today with progress moving in the opposite direction. The last point or argument we focus on is policies that use substitutions for race, such as income, or sometimes it's first generation status, those things that are more palatable, more folks feel more comfortable with. Those are important groups to focus on, and we focus on them as an organization as well. However, it's not the same as race, and they do not close the gaps in opportunity and outcomes for students of color. There's examples in the report and in research that other folks have done, and I'll use just a quick example because I know a lot of folks in this group are working hard on thinking about funding formulas and what's right. And there's examples of states like in Texas or even in Tennessee, where in their funding formula, they attach some rewards to either enrolling or graduating low-income students. And they've had some success with seeing some increases for that group, but at the same time seeing decreases in enrollment or completion for Black students or Latino students. And so again, I point that out as those states may articulate, wow, we address equity within our funding formula, and that's important to address low-income students, but it's not the same, and it doesn't mean they are doing anything around race. And in fact, the evidence suggests if you just focus on income, you will not be able to close racial equity gaps. So those are the arguments we make in the report, and again, provide more context and examples. We can go to the next slide now. And I do want to transition at this time over to my colleague, Dr. Marshall Anthony, to talk in more detail about some of the data points that we use to make some of these arguments. So please take it away, Marshall.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Again, thank you for the opportunity to discuss our report with you. I do want to give a quick acknowledgement to my colleague and supervisor, Dr. Andrew Nichols, who provided data contributions to the report as well. So to help make the case of why higher education institutions should implement race-conscious policies, I want to share a few foundational data points that we referenced in our report. The first point is around differences in degree attainment, as Dr. Jones mentioned earlier, between Black and white adults by age group. And degree attainment means the percent of the population that holds an associate's degree or higher. For the youngest group of Black adults ages 25 to 34, the percentage with a college degree has declined to 30%. and that bucks the trend of younger generations building on gains made by previous generations of Black adults. However, we see a different narrative for white adults by age group. For example, degree attainment among younger white adults ages 25 to 34 is nearly 10 percentage points higher than it is for older white adults age 55 to 64. And you can find additional information about these and other data points in our previous reports on degree attainment for Black adults, and we also have one on Latino adults as well. As a shameless plug, we're also working on a report now looking at those attainment numbers with updated information and disaggregating it and breaking it out by sex. The second key data point is around affirmative action and student enrollment. So as Assad mentioned, in states that have bans on affirmative action, each one saw declines in their enrollment of Black students at selective public colleges. So for example, in California at UC Berkeley, 8% of students enrolled in 1990 were Black. However, after the state's 1998 ban on affirmative action, Black student enrollment dropped to 4% and then to 2% in 2015, despite the Black population in California being 9%. And this is especially alarming because the racial demographics of public institutions funded by taxpayer dollars should ideally be representative of the racial demographics within that state. Next slide, please. So another key data point looked at differential completion outcomes between Black and white students within the same income group. Next slide, please. So in all four income groups, as you see on the table, white students are at least 11 percentage points more likely to complete a college degree than Black students at four-year institutions. And if you can see that within the completion gap column right in the middle of the table. The completion gaps are the largest in the lower middle, and upper middle income groups. But in the lower middle income group, this discrepancy was the largest. So as you see, white students in the lower middle income group were 17 percentage points more likely to graduate than their Black counterparts. And among students from families with the highest incomes, the completion gap was still considerable, but a bit smaller at 11 percentage points. So the key takeaway from this slide is that we cannot, as Dr. Jones mentioned before, just talk about income because Black students completed college at disproportionately lower rates than their white peers within the same income group. Give a little bit of time to view that. And next slide, please. Similar to the narrative around completion rates, we also see disproportionate outcomes in student loan default rates among Black and white students attending four-year institutions within the same income group as well. Next slide, please. So for example, as we see in this table, even among the highest income group, so if you look at the row that says high, even among that group, 1 in 3, or you see 34% Black students still default on their loans compared to only 5% of their white peers who default on their student loans. So the key takeaway from this slide is that across income groups, Black students default at higher rates than their white peers. So as a quick recap of a couple of the data points I briefly went over. First, Black students complete college at disproportionately lower rates than their white peers within the same income group. And then the second point is, as I just mentioned, Black students have disproportionately higher loan default rates than their white counterparts within the same income group. And at this point, I'll hand it back over to Dr. Tiffany Jones to discuss what race-conscious policies actually look like in higher education.
Thank you, Dr. Anthony. And hopefully, if you got nothing else, if you're not a numbers person and some of that felt like over your head, the main takeaway is even when looking at students of similar incomes, there are differences by race. it's just to help reemphasize the point that we started off with, which is you can't avoid these conversations. Focusing on income alone, you will still miss the mark in regards to race. You will still continue to have disparities by race unless there is something specifically done to address the needs of people of color in particular. So appreciate those data points to help make that case. And one kind of major takeaway as well there, even high, or what you would consider high income, the most privileged Black students are struggling. 1 in 3 of Black students who go to college right after high school, full time, to a 4-year college, from families earning over $120K a year. So these are most privileged group of Black students in higher ed. 1 in 3 still default on their student loans, which is the most egregious outcome. Doesn't mean you don't struggle with debt if you don't default. But default means that, again, it affects your credit, affects your ability to get a job, buy a house, even a car, So again, that's important to the conversation, because oftentimes when we do make policies that are based on financial need only, you leave out this whole group of Black folks, for example, in this conversation, who are above whatever that income cutoff is and are still really struggling. And again, we don't have enough time to break down why that is in all the details, but again, that's the legacy of slavery, of Jim Crow, of redlining, of all of the historic policies broadly, but also in higher ed, where the colleges they attend have gotten the least funding, et cetera. And the colleges that have gotten the most funding continue to exclude them. So that's just important case making for why we have to have a conversation around implementing more race conscious strategies. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about what a couple of those examples are. What does race conscious policy actually look like before we get into our small group discussion? So first, I'm going to start at the institutional level. I know we got some institutional leaders and folks in the room. The first recommendation is around admissions. We understand the majority of students in higher ed do not attend highly selective colleges. The reason we start here is that we do know that those are the most well-resourced colleges, though. And so it is important, and especially among the publics, they're being paid for by tax dollars. Black people, Latino people, they're taxpayers. And so if they cannot access public institutions, is a problem. So for those that do use selective admissions, we encourage using holistic admissions that include race as a factor. And that's why it's important that Marshall brought up the data around what happens when they're not allowed to use race as a factor because of a statewide ban on affirmative action. Really, it can be debilitating to an institution to be able to address race specifically in their admissions process. But definitely encourage institutions to do so. And for example, in California right now, they're taking the necessary steps to allow voters to reconsider their statewide ban on affirmative action. And their success so far in the state of Washington, there was a recent vote where, again, affirmative action was upheld, but by a very narrow margin. So those are suggest to me that some of that could be changing in the future in terms of removing those statewide bans on affirmative action. So that, again, admissions offices are able to address race more specifically. The second, again, related to admissions, and institutions should stop over-relying on traditional measures of merit, especially standardized test scores. It doesn't mean test scores can never be used as a factor at all. It just means the over-reliance, okay? And so, again, I used to work in admissions at a highly selective college, and we actually would call folks back to encourage them to attend after they had been admitted in order of their test scores. Test scores were driving so many parts of the admissions process. And what we're suggesting again is that institutions reconsider. Some have gone as far as going test optional, which is also important to kind of track what the impact is on equity over time. There's some good data there. So far, still early, but at places like Johns Hopkins, after they've gone test optional, they were able to increase their enrollment of low-income students, for example, significantly after doing that. So it's important that, again, institutions reconsider that. we don't necessarily just have a recommendation here that says go test optional, that'll do it, because what matters most is what you do instead. And so some have said, we'll get rid of the SAT, but we're gonna make up our own test. And we have no idea if that test is gonna be helpful to equity or not. So we're very careful there, just to say the most important thing that institutions can do is reconsider what they've been doing and walk back from emphasizing the test scores in such a significant way. They also even have to be careful about grades, as we use weighted grading systems and add bonus points for advanced placement courses, knowing that there's discrepancies where Black and Latino students have less access to AP courses. Even if they're in schools that offer them, they still have less access than their peers. And the data suggests once they do get access, they do just as well, but it's the challenges they face in getting recommended in the first place by teachers that believe that they have that ability. So again, it's important for institutions not to overemphasize some of these things. Again, one of my jobs in admissions was recalculating GPAs, and I watched students' GPAs jump from a 3.1 to, let's say, a 3.8 because they had taken all of these AP classes that were not available to students of color. So just want to emphasize there that it's very important that institutions reconsider what they're doing in admissions and the equity implications as of such. Institutions and policymakers should also provide more data disaggregated by race to help inform these conversations. So as I mentioned the Johns Hopkins example earlier, it's important that we would also be interested in knowing more about how did their what were the changes in enrollment by race as a result of going test optional. It's important to be able to track this information. A lot of the broadly available data just leaves out way too many students, especially at the federal level, often excluding students who go part-time, for example. And so again, just encouraging some better data disaggregation to be able to make policy decisions will be important, even at the institutional level. We can go to the next slide, please. I'm going to talk a little bit about states. I've already talked about affirmative action bans. When they're removed, it gives more freedom to institutional leaders. I think that there's folks who are against addressing race. They're racist and they don't want to. And then there's folks who are all bought in on race and say, I want to do everything I can to advance race. And then there's some folks in the middle who say, that seems like the right thing to do, but I'm not sure I can. And some of what affirmative action bans do is give cover to those folks. It scares them. It makes them feel like if we do this, we're going to get sued. Let's just make this easy and try and focus on geography or income. And so it's really important that those bans on affirmative action are removed and it's upheld at the Supreme Court level, continue to be, so that folks feel empowered to do what's right as it relates to focusing on race explicitly. States should also adopt statewide race-conscious higher ed attainment goals. The good news is that, in the state of Illinois, the state attainment goal does address race explicitly. There are many states, there's about 30 of the 40 or so states that have attainment goals do mention race explicitly. Now, moving forward to, do they set specific targets of how they want to close gaps by race? Do they have plans to actually close those gaps? Are different questions. And far fewer states have those things in place. So race-conscious statewide attainment goals mean mentioning race explicitly, but also talking about the existing gaps, committing to closing those gaps, and having some concrete plans of how you're going to get there. So that's important. And finally, states should invest in the colleges that serve students of color. I can't say this enough. In some states, California is one example, they spend almost 3 times as much on a student attending the University of California system as opposed to those attending a community college. About a quarter of Black students attend community college as one example, about half of Latino students, about 40% of Asian students. So when community colleges, for example, go underfunded, you're underfunding the institutions that already are committed to providing access and opportunity for students of color, and that impacts our experience. We know that, again, this is an issue in Illinois, just like across the states. Obviously, some of the concern even about Chicago State and funding and understanding what that would mean, what it means for that institution to be struggling financially, and when considering the overall access of Black students to 4-year colleges in the state is significant. And so again, most of the things that evidence suggests would help improve college completion and success, costs money. And oftentimes there's been a national study that suggests that there's about a $2,000 gap in spending per student between white students and Black students. Again, things like the CUNY ASAP program or other type of interventions at work, they cost about $2,000 per student. Most of the reason that colleges aren't using some of these strategies, they don't have the resources. So closing these gaps matter to student success and completion, specifically for students of color. So we can go to the next slide. And finally, just a couple of federal policy recommendations. The federal government also has to do the same in terms of investing in the colleges that serve students of color, making sure funding formulas, whether it be through the Higher Education Act or more recently through the CARES Act with stimulus related to responding to COVID. Every single time they should be consciously concerned with how many dollars are going to the colleges that need it the most. And they need it the most because they're serving the students who are coming in, having already attended the institutions that have been given the least. The federal government should require states to close racial gaps in spending both in K-12 and higher ed in order to participate in any new money, whether it be a state-federal partnership, whether you're talking about doing free college at the federal level or other new buckets of money. It's important that states should not be allowed to continue to spend the resources they have inequitably, giving more dollars to the colleges that exclude students of color and still continue to get new money from the federal government. Also, it's important that as the federal government is trying to figure out how to address student debt, what's the right policy, that they should be thinking about debt solutions that benefit students of color. This really matters because a lot of the pushback around, canceling student debt or addressing student debt, they often want to say, well, we should only focus on, again, folks below this particular income bracket. And sometimes it's very, very strict criteria. And again, as we've already discussed, there are middle and upper income Black students, for example, who struggle quite a bit with repaying their loans. So it's important to be designing these policies in a way that actually will help close those racial equity gaps. And the last thing I want to hint on is requiring accreditors to examine campus racial climate. And this matters because we've talked a lot about inputs and outputs, who gets enrolled, what happens when they leave, but not so much about what happens while they're there. And again, folks know that it matters that students have a healthy climate where they're free of bias, where they have mentors, they're supported, they're not feeling harassment, and when they do, there's action taken on their behalf. But there's no one responsible for making sure that's the case. There's too many colleges that are upheld as excellent and prestigious in higher ed and have terrible climates for students of color, and that goes unchecked. Accreditors are positioned to do deep dives into institutions more so than, let's say, state or federal policymakers. So our recommendation is that they perhaps are the entity that could take the necessary steps to prepare itself to do deeper dives related to campus racial climate. So no longer can a college get a stamp of approval as excellent, knowing that the students, even if they're graduating in what condition, having gone through what type of trauma. I encourage folks to take a look at the hashtag if you're on Twitter, Black in the Ivory, and there's another related to Black student affairs professionals that have been going on in these recent conversations around race, just to shed light on all of the challenges that folks are facing as individuals and how they're combating racism coming from faculty and departments and institutional leaders and their peers, and how that might impact their success and the success of the students that they're serving. So again, it's important to take these things into consideration. So we can go to the next slide. So kind of just a final thought before we transition to our small groups. One of the main issues that came up in our small group conversation is too often folks are ill prepared to address these issues, regardless of their race, whether they're white, they're Black. They are not prepared in higher ed to address issues of race. Courses, even if they are available, in this off chance that they are through ethnic studies or sociology, they're often optional in terms of course taking. There's not professors who are able to teach these types of courses that might leave students better equipped to address issues of race in their respective fields or in society more broadly. Again, folks don't know what language to use. They don't know anything about history or what's happened. And this matters in higher ed because higher ed produces the leaders who run all of these other systems. So if there's health disparities in healthcare, for Black women not getting the care that they deserve when they're giving birth, which results in higher infant mortality rates. Also, you know, in policing, for example, we've seen community colleges step up, at least a few in the last few weeks, saying, you know what, we're going to try and do a better job training police, because guess what? They come here for training. And if we haven't taught them anything about race, what have we done? I mentioned students not getting recommended for AP courses or getting the best advice. But what are higher ed institutions doing to train teachers and counselors as it relates to issues of race and racism? Do the graduates of these institutions leave with the tools they need to actually be effective in making change in all of the systems that they will one day lead? And the answer is not, higher ed is not doing enough. But if higher ed can do better and get this right, then that has an opportunity to disrupt inequity in so many other parts of our society. So there's a lot at stake, and this is why this matters so much. So we can go to the next slide. And what I want to do is just show you a short video animation, and then we will be able to go into our breakout groups. I'm going to see. Emily, are you? Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Martin Luther King Jr. imagined a country where Black people could enjoy the full benefits of citizenship and sought policy aimed at righting the wrongs of racial injustice. It would take nearly a century after the end of slavery for the civil rights movement to translate into modern legislation, with the adoption of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Higher Education Act, and an executive order that encouraged affirmative action. But the trend toward race-conscious policies would be short-lived. Since 1978, the Supreme Court has ruled on 5 cases attempting to overturn affirmative action in higher ed. Fortunately, in every case, the Supreme Court determined that affirmative action is constitutional and that colleges are allowed to consider race so long as certain criteria are met. Still, there are several cases in the court system and other state laws that seek to end the use of race in higher education policy and practice. Currently, 8 states have bans on affirmative action. Every single one of these states saw declines in their enrollment of Black students at selected public colleges after the ban. In other words, race-conscious policies do work. In fact, the only thing that bans impede is forward progress. Because today, Black adults are less likely to have a college degree than white adults were in 1990, affecting an entire generation of Black citizens. So why do we need race-conscious policies for higher ed? Because colorblind substitutes for race, like income, alone don't work. Completion outcomes differ for white and Black students even within the same income group. Black folks from the highest income families default on their student loans at nearly 7 times the rate of their white peers. Household net worth of Black college graduates is less than white high school dropouts. Income-based solutions will not right the wrongs of racial injustice that keep Black students from accessing and succeeding in college. Here's what will. 1, invest state and federal dollars in the places that are most likely to serve Black students: community colleges, historically Black colleges and universities, and minority-serving institutions, which have been traditionally underfunded. 2nd, hold institutions accountable for their racial climate on campus. That includes having a diverse faculty and curricula and how the institution responds to on-campus racial incidents. Next, bans on affirmative action must be removed and colleges should use holistic admissions that include race as a factor. Upholding affirmative action and race-conscious policies matter to every single institution that's committed to creating inclusive environments. Race-conscious policies are legal and beneficial, not just for college students themselves, but as they become future leaders who shape society for America as a whole.
Thank you. And so we wanted to share that animation with you because it helps summarize some of the key points we've discussed today. And then also it's there as a tool if you feel like in some of your work It's available on our website. Feel free to share as you find it helpful. And so what we'd like to do now is transition into a discussion about policies in your own state. We're going to take a few minutes and you're going to break into those same small groups, and you're going to talk about what actions you think it would take to be able to implement one of the race conscious strategies below, and also if there's anything you learned today you think that could help. And again, there's 2 policy options. I'll leave it up to you all and your facilitator to decide which you'd like to focus on in your small group. But first, of course, investing in the colleges that serve students of color, or pushing institutions to stop over-relying on traditional measures of merit in their admissions policies. So I think we can transition to the small groups now.
Again, apologies for never enough time for discussion, but we do want to have some time to just have some share out here as well. So we'll let folks get back in the main session here, which is currently happening, and turn it back over to our colleagues at the EdTrust.
I'm happy to jump in there and say, I hope everyone had rich discussions. You figured out how to fix all the policies in Illinois, I'm sure, in that 10 minutes.
Definitely.
But yes, I would love to hear your best ideas, and I'm sure your colleagues would too. So if there's anyone who wants to jump in first and talk about what policy issue you all kind of focused on, and anything you discussed related to what it would take to make it happen in the state of Illinois in terms of moving it forward. Is there anyone who wants to jump in and share? I'm happy to get us started quickly and say we focused on policy B around the admissions process. And some of the things folks said is reframing, standardized tests as being a high standard, but understanding its limitations is something institutions are just using out of convenience. So kind of challenging some of the framing around it. There's also some feedback that there's already some good groundwork in the state as it's related to this issue with folks interested and bought in around using multiple measures and admissions as well. So just a couple of things I heard. Is there anyone else who would like to jump in and note anything you heard in the conversation?
I can share a couple thoughts from my group. So I think one of the things that we noted is that policy A and B really work together. And that if we want to talk about stopping an over-reliance on traditional measures of merit, we have to make sure that the schools have the tools to support students in the event that they need additional help, that they can support them through programs like co-requisite remediation models, and that they really are sort of like you can have one without the other, but they're best when they work together. And then, I would also say my group wanted to kind of dive into, ensuring that students have equal access in the K-12 system to IB and AP and dual credit and many, many, many different ways that people then can be admitted to schools, and other measures that help them, beyond merit as an SAT or ACT score.
Thank you. How about somebody from a group that talked about policy related to resources and investing in the colleges that serve students of color? Any specific thoughts related to that policy and what it would take to make it happen in Illinois? Or even noting just what some of the barriers are.
So one of the things that I discussed with the group is how Northern Illinois University right now we're looking at policies and practices and the culture of the policies that we loosened or eliminated due to COVID, that led to more students enrolling in at NIU this semester. as well as we are up in retention. So we have taken note of the policies that were changed. Also, we looked at policies such as financial aid holds, students who owe money, and other holds that students have. Those are barriers that prevent students from re-enrolling. So as time goes on, those are the things that we're looking at. But someone also said that in the K through 12, a lot of students don't know about courses that they can enroll in AP courses, so that there's no test involved, because no one asked them or told them or informed them. And that is a conversation that I think as we go back into our respective institutions, is that to talk about just, putting the information out there for students to have a choice.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So maybe, I know we've got just a couple minutes left. If there are other questions that folks have for myself, or even for Marshall, we're happy to answer them as well.
I would say also any other reflections folks are having. I know that we've had some conversations before in this work group just generally about policy, and I know that there has been, much like Tiffany and Marshall talked about earlier, there's a desire to kind of use proxies of low income to talk about policy, and there's a challenge. There are challenges around talking about race-conscious policy, and that's become even more evident, obviously, in the current context and all of the conversations that are happening, universally in our country right now. But I'm curious what folks' reflections are now that we've seen some more data that's specifically about this is why race-conscious policy would be important, and here's how we can start thinking creatively about what that means. Would love to know folks' thoughts. And I see there's some activity in the chat box, so I'll take a look there too.
This is Eric from IBHE. I guess my question is related to what other states have done in terms of these overarching issues. And I was just wondering if any states have been able to successfully implement like either a direct or an automatic admissions policy, and then subsequently experience a better balance in terms of racial access and racial balance upon completion and entry into the workforce, or is it too early to tell? I guess essentially, do those policies like that, should those be considered as part of a policy quiver, in terms of addressing racial inequity and racial injustice?
I have less information about colleges that have recently made a change and then what happened when they changed. But we have a long history of taking a look at, there are certain types of institutions that are much better at enrolling students of color than others, and they take different approaches to admissions. So the less selective, quote unquote, colleges, such as community colleges, I gave out a few stats earlier about, about a quarter of Black students go there, and about 40% of Asian students go to community college, about half of Latino students go to community college, as an example of that. And then of course, the more selective the college is, and usually their selection criteria is really focused on standardized test scores in some combination with grades for most of the decision making. And then they make exceptions, considering some other criteria. those are the colleges that enroll fewer of those students. And again, you can even look at that at the 4-year level as well. Some of the more regional institutions that don't use the same type of criteria as the state flagships, for example, are much better at enrolling students of color and have been over time. So I think in some ways, we don't have to wait in terms of waiting for information in terms of institutions who've made recent changes, but I do think it's definitely worth a study of the institutions that have historically done a much better job at enrolling students of color, for example, as well. And so again, I think that some of what I've seen when it comes to being test optional specifically and making recent changes to that, I have seen some good data about enrolling more low-income students. I haven't necessarily seen the same thing around race, but some of that has to do with this just so new. It's hard to know. And it also matters a lot, what do they do instead of the SAT, right? Is it a new test they've used? Is it something else? Are they actually focusing on race? I think will matter quite a bit as well. I'm very interested to see what happens this fall because so many have been forced to kind of do something totally different than they've ever done before as it relates. And so it'll be exciting to see what the impact will be in terms of their ability to enroll more students of color. I think there are, really quickly, when it comes to, are there other states who figure this out as it relates to some of the other things that we've recommended? The other policy in terms of investing in students of color, outcomes-based funding, New Jersey's a great example. They have a recent funding formula. They're just implementing it. It tackles race explicitly. California was unable to do that. They felt like with their state ban on affirmative action, they would get sued if they did, so they haven't. And they're, for now in their new formula, focusing on low-income students. They're trying to focus on English language learners as well as first-generation students. So as examples, the state of Louisiana recently increased the weight that they're giving to students of color in their funding formula, as well as just another example of just states that have kind of been able to figure this out. And I like to bring those up as like different examples because they're in different parts of the country. Some are red, some are blue. Louisiana is purple-ish, and so it's an example of you can get this done regardless of what it looks like politically. In California is very blue, and of course they are unable to get it done around race until they get that ban removed. In terms of so again, it can be done just having the right folks in place sometimes, regardless of the political leanings of the state.
Yeah, and I'll just name, we've talked a little bit about direct admissions, and I think that it's worth revisiting the conversation as well. My understanding typically when it comes to direct admissions is that's not necessarily proactively race conscious, although it can have some impacts in terms of students choosing to enroll at higher rates from typically underrepresented groups like students of color and low-income students. But that's something we can dive into more, as we continue to move forward having these conversations about policy. And I wanted to shout out, there was Jordan from the EdTrust mentioned a conversation that they had about faculty for equity and trying to think if there could be kind of almost like a faculty task force across the state about how we dismantle institutionalized racism in our post-secondary institutions. So I just wanted to elevate that to the group here because that sounds like a really cool idea. So I can't wait for the full proposal for that to come out. But I want to say thank you very much to Tiffany and Marshall and the rest of the EdTrust team for being a part of this. Your work is terrific as always, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be able to learn from you. Here's our contact information. We will share the slide deck out with the group. We will also share the recording out with the group. The last thing I will say is that, MEC is working really hard on getting these projections together. So we will be in touch very shortly with calendar invitations about diving into those data and continuing these conversations about policy. And just really appreciate, again, the EdTrust laying the groundwork for us to think about how we can be race conscious in that work and not just focus on proxies that may tangentially impact students of color. We will share the recording out from today. We will share the slides out from today. If you somehow got onto this webinar by accident, like you didn't get a calendar invitation or it was forwarded to you, feel free to email LaTanya if you would like to join the work group moving forward. We'd love to have you.